The air in the basement archives of the CIA was stagnant, smelling of old paper and the ozone of flickering fluorescent tubes. It was 1977, and for a low-level document specialist, the world was a monotonous place. However, luck, or perhaps a lingering ghost of justice, intervened. While processing a stack of misfiled financial records, the archivist stumbled upon a series of crates that shouldn't have existed. 4 years prior, in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms had issued a scorched earth order to destroy all records pertaining to the agency's behavioral modification programs. He wanted the evidence of decades of human experimentation to vanish into the incinerators. But these folders had been mislabeled as mundane accounting logs, escaping the purge. As the archivist pulled a folder from the pile, the mundane reality of the office dissolved into a discovery of institutional madness. The protagonist's hands shook slightly as they realized the magnitude of the find. The records revealed a world governed by the frantic paranoia of the Cold War. In the 1950s and 60s, the American intelligence community was driven by fear of Soviet brainwashing. They believed the Kremlin had developed technologies to rewrite the human personality. This existential dread served as a blank check for the CIA to abandon every ethical boundary. They were convinced that the only way to beat the Soviets was to outmonster them. The agency embarked on a quest for the ultimate weapon, the total control of the human psyche. They wanted to break the human spirit and turn it into a blank slate. This was the birth of MKUltra, a program shrouded in absolute, impenetrable secrecy. For the young archivist, curiosity morphed into a moral compulsion. The files spoke of Sub-Project 68, a designation for its high costs and disturbing supply lists. The archivist felt the weight of the massive agency, a silent warning to put the folder back. Yet the drive to uncover the truth was undeniable. Every page turned felt like a small act of rebellion. They weren't just reading records, they were witnessing the systematic dismantling of human dignity. It was a clandestine crusade conducted in the margins of society. It became clear that this was not a localized operation, but a web of deceit spanning the country. At the center of this darkness stood Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a man known in whispers as the Black Sorcerer. Gottlieb was a chemist who believed the mind could be chemically shattered and then rebuilt. He was a man who saw morality as an obstacle to progress. His mandate was clear: find a way to crack the human mind. He experimented with everything from paralytics to hallucinogens, seeking the combination that would force a person to reveal their secrets or perform actions against their will. To Gottlieb, the human brain was merely a stubborn lock, and he was the locksmith willing to use any tool to pick it. The archivist's internal struggle grew with every revelation. It was one thing to hear rumors of espionage. It was quite another to see proof that the government viewed its citizens as expendable laboratory rats. The documents described subjects being dosed without their knowledge, their lives ruined for data points. The realization was a sickening blow. The government, meant to be a shield, it had become a predator lurking in the dark. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The final document provided the most terrifying realization. It wasn't a summary of theories, but a specific name, an innocent civilian whose life had been intercepted by the agency's shadow. Seeing that name made the project real. It stripped away the clinical distance of Sub-Project 68 and replaced it with a human face. The archivist realized the scale was far beyond any battlefield. It was in the cities, hospitals, and homes of people who thought they were safe. This was just the beginning of a rabbit hole leading into the heart of darkness. The files led the archivist away from the sterile, fluorescent hallways of the Virginia archives and into the neon-stained shadows of San Francisco and New York. Under the banner of Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA had established safe houses, Apartments rigged with one-way mirrors and high-end recording equipment. Here, the agency employed sex workers to lure unsuspecting citizens back to these rooms, where they were covertly dosed with high-potency LSD. From behind the glass, Sidney Gottlieb and his team would sit in shadows, clutching glasses of bourbon and taking meticulous notes as they watched the subjects' lives unravel in a chaotic, drug-induced frenzy. It was a voyeuristic nightmare masquerading as national security. These men weren't Soviet assets or dangerous spies. They were ordinary workers and students who had walked into a trap set by their own government. The betrayal was intimate and calculated, turning the sanctuary of the city into a hunting ground for human souls. The deeper the archivist dug, the more the tragic figure of Frank Olson began to dominate the narrative. Olson was a biological warfare scientist, a man of the system who had seen too much of the darkness brewing within the MKUltra laboratories. In 1953, during a secluded retreat at Deep Creek Lake, Gottlieb decided to test the limits of his chemicals on his own staff. He spiked Olson's Cointreau with a massive dose of LSD without any warning. The resulting psychological collapse was catastrophic. Tormented by the sudden disintegration of his reality and the moral weight of his work, Olson became a liability the agency could not afford. Days later, he allegedly fell through a closed window on the 13th floor of a New York hotel. The files whispered a different story, one of internal ruthlessness and a fall that was likely a cold-blooded push. Olson's death served as a grim signal. The quest for mind control would not tolerate hesitation even from those who wore the agency's badge. Beyond the safe houses, the documents outlined Sub-Project 68's even more aggressive assaults on the human consciousness. The archivist read accounts of depatterning techniques that sounded more like medieval torture than modern science. Victims, often seeking help for simple anxiety or postpartum depression, were instead subjected to electroshock therapy dozens of times more powerful than any medical standard. They were forced into chemically induced comas that lasted for 77 days, their minds bombarded with looped recordings played through headphones for 20 hours a day. It was an attempt to achieve a tabula rasa, a blank slate where the CIA could rewrite a more compliant personality. They weren't curing patients. They were hollowing them out like shells, stripping away their dignity for the sake of experimental data. The human cost was etched into every ink-stained margin. The archivist found transcripts of victims who had forgotten the faces of their own children or the sound of their spouses' voices. These individuals were reduced to data points, collateral damage in a war that had no front lines. The agency didn't record their suffering, only the efficacy of the shattering. In Gottlieb's eyes, this was a patriotic necessity. He believed the human mind was the final frontier of the Cold War, and if a few thousand souls had to be sacrificed to ensure the West's survival, he would pay that price without blinking. To him, morality was a luxury the era could not afford, and empathy was a weakness that the Soviets would surely exploit. As the archivist turned the final pages of the Midnight Climax records, the silence of the basement archives became oppressive. They noticed that the light in the hallway was no longer flickering. It was steady, as if someone had just adjusted it. A shadow moved near the heavy steel door, a brief, sharp flicker of a dark suit. The archivist realized they weren't just reading history. They were becoming a target within it. The realization that they were being watched turned their blood to ice. They tucked a small stack of the most damning financial ledgers under their coat, their heart hammering with a frantic, desperate rhythm. The exit was no longer a path home. It was a gauntlet through a building that felt less like an office and more like a predator waiting to strike. The archivist slipped through the heavy steel doors, the cold air of the Virginia night hitting them like a physical blow. Under the heavy wool of their coat, the stolen financial ledgers felt like lead weights, the only surviving physical evidence of a decade of institutionalized madness. To understand the weight of these papers, one had to look back 2 years to the sweltering heat of the 1975 Church Committee hearings. There, in a room filled with the scent of old mahogany and the collective breath of a shocked nation, the world first heard the whispered name MKUltra. The senators sat in stunned silence as the skeletal remains of the program were laid bare. Richard Helms had done his job well in 1973, ordering the wholesale destruction of almost every folder, transcript, and tape associated with the project. But he had missed the money. He had forgotten that even the most secret horrors leave a trail of invoices and vouchers, and it was these receipts that the archivist now carried into the light. The emotional climax of those hearings wasn't found in the cold statistics of chemical doses, but in the trembling voice of a survivor who stood before the microphones. They spoke of the white noise that never truly stopped and the missing years of their youth that had been systematically erased during a 77-day induced coma. The survivor described the sensation of waking up in a world where they no longer knew the name of their mother or the color of their childhood home. The room felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it. This wasn't just a failure of ethics. It was the state-sponsored murder of the soul. The black sorcerer, Sidney Gottlieb, had succeeded in creating his tabula rasa, but he had left behind a graveyard of living people who could no longer recognize themselves in the mirror or remember the warmth of a loved one's hand. Back in 1977, the archivist knew that these new fragments, these misfiled financial records, were the final nail in the coffin of secrecy. They met a journalist in the rain-slicked parking lot of a nondescript diner on the outskirts of Washington. The exchange was silent and terrified. By handing over those ledgers, the archivist was ensuring that the story of Operation Midnight Climax and the betrayal of citizens like the innocent civilian found in the files would never be buried again. It was a redemptive act, a small flicker of light meant to pierce the overwhelming shadow cast by the agency. The press took the documents, and soon the names of the safe houses and the details of the black sorcerer's chemical warfare on the American public were splashed across every front page. The wall of silence had finally crumbled, though the cost of the breach was yet to be fully realized by those who lived in the agency's long shadow. Yet the resolution was bitter. While MKUltra was officially disbanded and Sidney Gottlieb retreated into a quiet suburban obscurity, the darkness didn't truly dissipate. The techniques developed in those windowless rooms, the sensory deprivation, the psychological breaking points, and the pharmaceutical manipulation, did not disappear with the project's name. Instead, they were absorbed into deeper, blacker programs, hidden behind layers of classification that even the Church Committee could not penetrate. The technology of the mind had been mastered, and the agency was not about to discard its most potent weapon. The legacy of MKUltra was a permanent scar on the American psyche, a chilling reminder that the line between protector and predator is often blurred by the desperation of war. It left behind a fundamental loss of innocence and a lingering suspicion that the hand extended in help might be holding a needle. The most haunting aspect of the declassified records remains what they do not say. The ghost files, the thousands of documents Richard Helms successfully incinerated in 1973, represent a void in history that can never be filled. We have the invoices, but we do not have the names of all the victims. We have the theories, but we do not have the full results of the most extreme experiments. The archivist's discovery was a victory, but it was a partial one. Somewhere in the classified vaults that remain, the quest for the ultimate weapon of the mind likely continues, shielded by new names and even more complex layers of denial. The story of MKUltra is not a closed chapter. It is a warning that the battle for the human soul is fought in the shadows, and the documents we see are only the fragments of a much larger, more terrifying truth that remains hidden just out of reach.